Okay. All right. Last week we talked about Samuel Bach, a Jewish artist who reappropriated Christian themes for our deeper contemplation. And we talked about the violence of the show of the Holocaust that he captured in his artwork. We talked about the violent ending of the Gospel of Mark, in which before four different endings were added, we are left with silent, terrified women and Jesus on the cross. And we talked about the violence of the crucifixion. This week, we're going to talk about another kind of violence, and that violence is interpretive violence. How do we read texts as readers? And in our reading, do we treat violence as normal and skim over it? This is connected to Mark 16, because so many people have just plowed into the four resurrection type of endings added to Mark much later, and really do not linger at the cross. So this week, I want us to focus on 2 Kings 5. And I'm going to share screen for a little bit, only a little, because Jean is going to hold forth. She very graciously consented to do a semi-biblical story telling of 2 Kings 5. So a little enslaved girl through the lens of trauma. And we are going to, slideshow. We are going to hear from Jean now. And she, Jean, you can the kind of storytelling you're doing. Okay, and Steve, you want to, can you focus on Jean?
Okay.
For this one? If she's speaking, can you focus on speaker? Yes. Take it away, Jean.
You're on.
Naaman, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man and in high favor with his boss, the king, because through Naaman, the Lord had given victory to Aram. Although Naaman was a mighty warrior, he suffered from leprosy. Now the Arameans, on one of their raids, had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his king just what the little girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, "Go then, and I'll send along a letter to the king of Israel." He went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of leprosy." When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to give death or life that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Just look and see how he's trying to pick a fight with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me so that he will learn that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance to Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be clean." But Naaman became angry and went away, saying, I thought that for me, surely he would come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord and wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Aren't Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be clean? He turned and went away in a rage. But his servants approached and said to him, Sir, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, wouldn't you have done it? How much more when all he said was wash and be clean? So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean.
Oh, thank you, Jean. It just brings everything alive. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Jean has recorded this reading for my intro class. I try to use her biblical storytelling whenever I can, and the students really, really appreciate it. Again, when scripture gets read like the phone book, nobody listens, right? Nobody listens. Thank you, Jean. That's awesome. It gives me chills.
Happy
Okay.
to be of help.
Oh, you are more than helpful, believe me. Okay, so can you all see this?
You're not sharing now.
Oh, dang. Okay, let me go back and share screen. Here we go. Okay, so thank you, Jean. And I am going to go to slideshow. So this story, many of you are probably not familiar with. It is part of the Elisha cycle in the book of 2 Kings, and it takes up 13 chapters, almost 13 chapters, centered on the prophet Elisha, who is the successor to the prophet Elijah. And both Elijah and Elisha were prophets in the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember, by this time, and for Elisha, it's around 750 to 745 BCE. At this, Saul, David, and Solomon has split after Solomon's death into 2 kingdoms. So the southern kingdom is Judah, the northern kingdom is Israel. Elijah and Elisha are active in the northern kingdom. Unfortunately, it's also the time when the Assyrian Empire is expanding. It is a voracious empire. It is a brutal empire. Its mode of operation is to conquer a region and depopulate it of the natives, and then ship in people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire to repopulate the region. And that really throws people off balance, keeps them from revolting as the Assyrian Empire grows. And here we see a portrait by Frederick Leighton, Elisha raising the son of the Shunammite woman. And oh, I have an article for you on this that takes it to task, believe me, but that's another story. So let's get situated for this story. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, Peggy, you're mute, I think.
All right, I'm going to mute everybody. Denise, you'll have to turn yourself back on.
Okay, oops. To do that, I have to. Okay, all right. So geographically, you can hear me now? Can you hear me? Oops. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. All right. So let me go back to screen share. No one was responding. So, You can all see this? Someone say yes?
Not yet.
Can't see your slides yet. And Denise, sometimes your voice fades in and out. I don't know what, if,
That's probably Comcast in my building. Ever since they upgraded the neighborhood service, I have had real problems with that, and I'm going to call Comcast on Monday and ask them what they've done. So if you need me to repeat, raise your hand so that Steve can see it, or put something in the chat that Steve can look at and say, repeat what you just said, okay? So geographically, we're talking about Naaman, and here is if you can see my cursor, the Dead Sea. Here's the Jordan River. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Now, Jerusalem is right about here, northwest of the northern tip of the Dead Sea. This is the southern Judah. This is the northern kingdom of Israel. Its capital is Syria. Aram, which is another name for Syria, is north, just north of the northern kingdom of Israel. Damascus is its capital. The river Abana and Pharpar are here, and they're major rivers running through Aram or Syria. Aram is in league with the Assyrian Empire for conquest. And the little girl has been taken captive from the northern kingdom when the Syrians or the Aramaeans have conducted raids into northern Israelite territory. Okay. Now, this passage, 2 Kings 5, 1 through 14, is cited by Jesus in Luke 4:27 in his sermon in the Nazareth synagogue. And the way in which Jesus used this text is to point up, to underscore God's universal power and grace. And scholars have taken a cue from that, and they see it as a foreshadowing or an affirmation of Jesus' inclusive history. Okay, because here is Israel's God curing a foreign military commander. I mean, this guy is the head general for Syria's army. Okay, and look at the inclusivity of Israel's God. God is universal sovereign, right? And this foreshadows Jesus' inclusive ministry. I don't like the word foreshadow because it invites people to see that somehow 2 Kings is predicting Jesus' inclusive ministry. I always stop my students and say, look, these texts don't know anything about Jesus, okay? It's the later church reinterpreting the Bible texts in light of the church's experience of Jesus' ministry and death. That's a very different thing from prediction or foreshadowing or promise and our Bible. In my mind, what links the two parts of our Bible is the notion of covenant. And I think that is affirmed in 1 Corinthians 11, when the words of institution for the Eucharist are spoken. This is the cup of my blood in the new covenant. Okay, so that's something you can chew on instead of this mechanical, okay, this text predicts this. This text in Hebrew Bible predicts this in New Testament. No, no, no. As I tell my students, I will haunt you if you say that. Okay? Questions on that so far? Steve, any questions in the chat or hands raised? I guess not. Okay. Oh, in the John Gaffney is asking, will we be able to get copies of this week's and last week's slides? Steve, can you answer that question? Steve? Let's stop the share.
He, I think he answered it in the chat that he would.
Okay. Let me go back to screen share. All right, so John, those slides are coming, and I discovered the proper slides just a couple hours after our meeting last Sunday. They were in a folder that I didn't look in. Bad. Okay, so now I said that 2 Kings 5, this text that we're looking at, was part of the Elisha cycle, but the Elisha cycle is part of a larger collection of traditions called the Deuteronomistic history. And if my students can pronounce that word, they get an extra 5 points. History runs all the way from Joshua through Judges, Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. It is an expansive collection of literature, and it was probably brought together in Babylonian exile, because the Deuteronomistic history ends at the end of the very last chapter of 2 Kings with the Judean king released from Babylonian prison and basically put under house arrest. He has to stay in Babylon. He's given new clothes. He has to dine at the Babylonian king's table so the king can keep an eye on him. And the question remains for Israel, what will become of us? Is the covenant broken? Will God be in relationship with us? Will the divinity ends with a cliffhanger and are meant to trace Israel's coming into the land, establishing itself, establishing kingship, and then splitting the kingdom, and then finally seeing the northern kingdom, Israel, conquered by Assyria, and the southern kingdom, Judah, conquered by Babylon. And this tradition will help the people understand why this happened to them. Why did this happen to them? And the Deuteronomistic history is somewhat of Harold West called transcript. In other words, the ruling powers of Israel want the people to see it covers over some marginalized voices and does not discuss power relations. It also concretizes what Tiffany Houck-Loomis calls a dominant exilic trope or motto. The rulers want the people to see exile as Israel's punishment for disobeying, for violating the covenant and splitting the kingdom in two. So this is a way for the Deuteronomistic history for the people to take responsibility for their actions that put them into exile. As this trope became so cemented in the Israelite mind that it really became a kind of characterological shame that convinced the people that they were worthless. And Tiffany argues that this blocks mourning the effects of intergenerational and prolonged trauma. You always go back to square one. It's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. And that is maladaptive response. It kind of mirrors the difference between guilt and shame. When you're guilty of one misstep, you can say, oh, I messed up. I'll do better next time. I know what to avoid. I can be better. When you give a maladaptive response, you're so convinced of your utter worthlessness that you feel powerless to change. And I have to say, and this is another class that we could do sometime in the future, that it is the fundamental misinterpretation of Genesis 2 and 3 and the disobedience in the garden that has convinced Christians that they are worthless sinners. And we can couple that with our discussion last week of argue that Jesus died for our sins, and that the only way to our sins and make us do better is for Jesus to die for us. I really consider that a maladaptive response. But we can talk about that a little later. Okay, so the public transcript is the Deuteronomistic history, of which 2 Kings 5 is a part. What about the hidden transcript, the marginalized voices? Those voices are by their place in the Deuteronomistic history. They are basically bulldozed because the Deuteronomistic history has an agenda, right? And that agenda flattens the texts and allows us to violence against marginalized co-opted voices. That's all a comfortable reading. You know, we can read it and say, oh, there's a larger theological point at work here. And boy, that's a good theological point. And so what if there's a little collateral damage? We just skim right over it. So 2 prime examples of the hidden transcript, I believe, are the little enslaved girl in 2 Kings 5 and Rahab in Joshua 2. We're not doing Rahab this session, but the little enslaved girl. Now, next, I want to alert you to some characteristics of Hebrew Bible narrative. Particularly Hebrew Bible text. In other words, there are holes in it. The narratives of Hebrew Bible are characteristically terse. They say 2 words. They don't go into long descriptions of people or of clothing or of places unless the details are important for the meaning of the narrative. So a lot of details are missing. A lot of characters are silent. Narrative is very purposeful about choosing words. This is not sloppy. Important. So knowing this and knowing our gaps and that this is a very masterful Hebrew Bible storyteller or storytellers, we are invited purposely to fill in the gaps. It's almost as if when this was told and handed down orally for generations and then finally written down, it's almost as if the narrators planned to suck us in, right? And a perfect example of that, and please, Steve, interrupt me if you see a in the
We
chat.
just lost your sound
Oh,
for a critical 5 words there.
okay. Let's see, last 5 words. Okay, I think what I said was that the narrator, the storytellers purposely leave the gaps in the text to suck us into the text, to draw us into the story. Did you hear that?
Yes.
Okay. So a perfect example of that, Samuel chapter 11. And that's the story of David and Bathsheba. So I'm going to go to that very quickly and read just the first verse of 2 Samuel 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, it sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, which is the capital of Ammon. David remained at Jerusalem. Okay. Tell us why David remained at Jerusalem. Anybody?
No clue.
No clue. The text is silent. So if we're reading carefully, we stop and scratch our heads and we say, how did he remain in Jerusalem? Now, another characteristic of Hebrew narrative is that the narrator will never, hardly ever, render a judgment on what's going on in the story. But with the gaps, we're almost compelled to render our own judgment. What do you think David's staying in Jerusalem when he sends Joab, who's his chief general, and all his officers and all Israel to go fight the Ammonites? And David, who is king, stays in Jerusalem. What do you think about that? Anybody? Anybody?
Anybody gonna turn their mics on?
Has he met Bathsheba yet?
No, he has not met Bathsheba yet, which
Oh.
begs the question, if he'd been at war, he would never have met her, right?
Correct, yeah.
Begs the question, where is he supposed to be?
Yeah, at war.
At war with his troops, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, with his troops. So we've already made a judgment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the gaps help us to do that. I love Hebrew Bible narrative because of that. Okay, so the gaps invite what the rabbis in the Talmud called midrash. Comes from a Hebrew root, darash, which means literally to seek or inquire. And here I have a picture on the slide of a Bible, Psalm 119, which is the longest psalm in the Psalter of more than 100 verses. It's a wisdom psalm.
You're not sharing screen right now.
I don't know how that happened. I didn't do anything. Okay, I'm going to escape and I'm going to go back to share screen. I didn't do a thing. Okay, share screen.
We always have an unannounced participant here named Murphy, and he brings his law with him.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know how that happened. Didn't touch the thing except to advance the slide. Oh, Murphy, stay away. Okay, so here is Midrash, an open page of the Bible, and the rabbis believed that there is white fire and black fire on the biblical page. The black fire are the letters, the words, the verses that are printed on the page. The white fire is the space between the letters, the space between the words, the space between the lines, the space between the verses. And the rabbis say we have to read both the black fire and the white fire. That's what Midrash is. It's including the white fire, reading between the lines, reading in the gaps. And you already saw from Jean that we already read between the lines when we read scripture, or when we storytell scripture, or when you have the choral speakers doing presentations of scripture. Are there stage directions with the Bible? No, the Bible does not tell you when to whisper, when to shout, when to pause, when to speed up, right? You make those decisions, and in making those decisions, you are reading the white fire, you're reading in the gaps, you're reading in between the lines. Any comments on that from anybody?
No, but
Jean's
thank you.
reading filled in a lot of the white fire.
Right. Yeah, but thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, we need more help in supporting this. Yeah, this is great.
well, I'm here anytime you want that support. The Bible becomes a dead thing and not the living word of God. We might as well just etch it in stone, read it, and not think about it. This is crucial for connecting this Bible with our own lives. Crucial. Okay, so when we're reading the story of the enslaved girl, I want to do what Dana Fuel at Drew recommends, and that is to read with interruption. And she calls that a strategy of reading. And that means after you read something, Stop and question the text, especially if you feel that something is ethically off. Hearing the text, performing the text ought to be an ethical encounter. It ought to make us stop and imagine how to tell the story differently and therefore differently. And that's what I want us to do with the little enslaved girl. We don't do enough of this. We take the text at face value, and oh my gosh, that has fueled the Crusades. That has fueled chattel support for chattel slavery. Genesis 9, which also used to abolitionist movement. Okay.
We're losing your sound.
Oh, okay. What was the last thing you heard?
Go back about 2 sentences.
Oh, boy. Okay. Reading with interruption means that we are invited to imagine how to tell the story differently and therefore how to live differently in our own lives. If we just read superficially and don't dig in, do the white fire, read in the gaps, read in between the lines, then we are going to reinforce a dangerous use of the biblical text. And an example would be the so-called curse of Ham in Genesis 9, which was used to affirm and legitimate chattel slavery. Did you all hear that?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please let me know. I just, Xfinity is, that's, okay. So here we come to the text finally. You're all saying, when's she going to get to the text? Well, 2 Kings 5:1. Jean did a great job in contrasting Naaman, who is in Hebrew called an Ish Gadol, which means a great man. A great man. And because he was a great man, a warrior, that's often used for a warrior, he is with the king of Aram. But then she whispered, but he had leprosy. Now, we don't know if he had Hansen's disease, but he had some physical. It's a sign of God's punishment. It was a physical manifestation of God's punishment. So look at the contrast. Great man, Ish Gadol, and he's got a skin disease. By Jean to highlight that contrast. And further, look at the contrast. Pleasant, and he's got no one wants to be near him. No one else. And Jean also raised this. Let's see. It says at the end of verse 1 that by him, meaning by Naaman, the Lord had given. Notice how the Deuteronomist is asserting God's universal sovereignty. The only reason successful in battle was because God allowed him to be. Israel's God allowed him to be. God is using foreign nations like Assyria, like Aram, like Babylon to punish Israel. And then we get more contrast between the two kings, the king of Israel and the king of Aram. And Jean did a great job with the moody postures of these kings. One.
Oh, this is terrible.
We just lost your sound again for 2 sentences there.
Oh, crap.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
just spoke of the moody postures of the kings. That's the last
Okay,
thing we heard.
thank you. Moody postures of the king. The king of Aram sends a letter and said, have your prophet cure my general. him to just summon the other king is insulting to the king of Israel. And as Jean said, he's trying to pick a fight with me. So, they're kind of like Abbott and Costello in this. And again, it's Israel's way of saying our God is superior to your gods and your rulers. And remember, gods and rulers in the ancient tied together. If one ruler and his army conquers another ruler and his army, it means their God has conquered the other ruler's God. Okay, here's another contrast. We've got the mighty man, and in verse 2, we've got the little girl. Verse 2, now the Arameans on one of their raids had taken a young captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naam. Is Na'ara Kutana. Na'ara by itself is young girl, and Kutana is small, a small young girl. So there's the Ish Gadol, the great man, versus the vulnerable little girl. Okay? She was taken captive in a raid. Israel and Judah know about raids. In Deuteronomy 20, which is one of the chapters that lines out the rules for holy war, God gives Israel permission to take spoils of war, which would include cattle and also men, women, and children. And then, of course, there are other texts in Hebrew Bible that talk about raids of other countries on Israel and Judah, and they're taking spoils. But look at the contrast. Warrior, little tiny girl. But we're not told her age. All we know is she's a little tiny girl. Now,
Please.
yes?
Okay, Na'ara is actually a young woman. If it was a little girl, she'd more likely be Yelda.
No. Na'ar is a youth. I'm not sure where you're getting that from.
I'm Jewish.
I can show you a Bible Brown Driver Briggs dictionary in which that is not the case. That's interesting. I don't know if you're getting that from a source or from a rabbi, but Na'ara is the feminine of Na'ar, and Na'ar is a youth.
It is youth, but it's not a young child. They're not that little. They're almost like a younger adult, maybe a teenager.
Yalda is a woman of marriageable age.
Yelda is a child. Yeled.
Maybe. Let's.
I don't want to take your time. Your lecture is interesting.
Okay, well, I appreciate your input. I do disagree with you on Na'ar. I think Katana, let's compromise, is saying this is a little one.
Yes,
okay.
She is. Yeah, Katana is definitely on the little side, but it's I would feel more, I understand where you're coming from, but she may be a smaller woman,
Okay, well, I you look it up in a concordance and see how that word is used in different contexts, and you may come up with something different. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you for your interpretation, though. I do appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we be focusing on her age or her vulnerability?
Both.
Vulnerability.
Both. The problem is we're not told her age. I'll get to that a little later. Okay. All right. So let's listen to, there's verse 2, which I just read. On the slide, verse 3. She said to her mistress, and Jean did a great job with this, if only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Is there a gap? Do you see a gap between verses 2 and 3? What do y'all think? How did we get from verse 2 to verse 3? Does the text say?
Nope.
No, no.
Oh.
All we know is that she didn't serve Naaman's wife. The Hebrew is literally, she was before Lifnei, Naaman's wife. So that, the translation, English translations try to make that a little more clear. How do we get from verse 2 to verse 3? Why does she suggest a cure for Naaman? She was taken captive, right?
Yeah. Huh.
The hidden transcript of this text, I think, rests in the gap between verse 2, describing her status as a captive, and verse 3, her wish for Naaman's healing. And I spelled Naaman wrong on that slide. Should be 2 A's at the front. Okay, so Naaman is misspelled here.
Yeah, but
So-
she clearly wants to help him in some way. Yeah, she offers.
Well, that's what we think. And that's what most commentators think. Do you fill in the gaps? So, okay, Carol just gave us, she clearly wants to help. Can you tell? Why would she want to help?
Good
Thank
question.
you.
Good question.
Yeah, good response. I like the How do others of you fill in the gaps between those two verses? I'll go back to the two verses. Somebody else? What do you think of how would you characterize the little girl in verse 3?
Pretty self-confident.
Self-confident, says Alvin. Okay, yeah, she seems pretty assertive. What else? Anybody else?
Jean could have given another reading here and just had this quotation dripping with sarcasm.
Aha.
If only my Lord were here with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of the leprosy.
Jean, you want to describe what you did in that verse so we're not talking for you?
Right. Well, Steve is right. It could have been done that way. And when you were talking about filling in the gaps by how you read something, well, you have choices and you're interpreting it just by reading it. So yeah, that could have been a else like, we people from Israel, we Samaritans have good healthcare system. Why do people, too bad for you. Since, the point of this presentation is all about the little girl and what's on her mind. I remember the first time I was doing this and we talked about all the different things could be on our mind. I thought like, man, that's an awful lot I got to pack into one line in which she is not really even talking about herself. So it could be I want to help you out. I know something and I can contribute. And, okay, so maybe that makes me a more important part of this household because I've got some useful information. Another possibility, it can go on from there, is some kind of Stockholm syndrome. She's been kidnapped.
Okay. All right. So Jean, I think, did the right thing. Instead of dictating the meaning of that verse, she kind of tread a middle ground. And it really opens up the text for other interpretations. So I'm glad she didn't do what you're suggesting, Steve, because then it gives me the chance to ask this question and have us read with interruption and compare or contrast verse 2 with verse 3 and fill in the gaps ourselves. So I think Jean did, but you're absolutely right, Steve. There are other ways to read it. Yep. Anybody else? This little girl in verse 3. We heard confident. We heard sarcastic. What else?
Well, we don't know the time frame, how long she had been there serving as a captive, because that could make a big difference in how close she felt to the woman she was serving and to her Lord. It's
Yep.
kind of interesting that she called him my Lord. I realize it's a technical term, but that may indicate a closer connection to him than you might otherwise think.
Okay, I like the first half of what you said, Alvin, in terms of we don't know how long she was there. But secondly, my Lord is a term of address, of respect for someone who is above you. And that would be standard language that she would use in talking about her captor. Okay, anybody else? What's going on? How would you describe the little girl in verse 3? I want one more description. Would you say she was faithful? Okay. All right. So let's see what commentators do with this little girl. And I will say that to them put the little girl on a pedestal. And when I first read about this, I was absolutely blown over by what they said about her. So let me give you a few quotes. Esther Men, who does a lot of work with children and women in Hebrew Bible. And this is the quote from Esther. In a time of killing and destruction, she, the little girl, focuses her attention on healing and restoration, even for the military leader on the other side, unquote. Her heart is, quote, full of compassion, unquote, even for the enemy responsible for her captivity, unquote. Men concludes, quote, that a little Israelite servant girl should have such insight points to the perceptiveness of children about matters of faith, unquote. Then Jean Kyung Kim has a midrashic retelling of the story, and she argues, quote, despite her insignificance and obscurity, the little girl becomes the first instrument of God in the narrative, unquote. Read further in this story, you'll find that Elisha's servant Gehazi really is replaced by the little girl because she understands the prophet's healing powers while he does not. And then Julie Faith Parker calls the little girl unique in the Elisha cycle and maintains that he takes initiative. There's that and magnanimity, greatness. She is, quote, a paragon of respect, composure, knowledge, and wisdom, unquote, in comparison to the ridiculous Israelite king. Blown over by that. I have a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old I have grandchildren. And I remember my kids at 8 years old. I don't think I could say these words about them, or at 10 or at 12, really. I think that other interpreters surrender the little girl to their larger theological point. Learn from other peoples, from the small.
Dr.
Not among-
Dombkowski, isn't there a reason that the narrator put this little girl in there? She's a tool to explain why a mighty warrior would go to a vassal kingdom and ask for help. Otherwise, it looks like the Naaman is out of his mind. Why would he possibly go to Israel? And this little girl explains it. So she's a necessary tool of the story, isn't she?
That's a good point. She is a foil. She is a foil for the power of Elisha and of Elisha's God. But if we look at her as only a foil, then marginalize her and we co-opt her voice. You're absolutely right. You're making my point. That's an excellent observation. Stephen Ferris that notes that the exiled little girl does not hate her captors. How that from the little, I do not know. He's really filling in a whole lot on the white fire, and I don't see a hook to really hang that on. Harris's theological point is that if God's grace is always for those on the underside, it becomes predictable grace. God's grace is just there when we least expect it. And on a pedestal and claim is the most important biblical scholar of the last century. Even Walter Brueggemann waxes eloquent about, actually waxes rhapsodic theological point that that good news always shatters contexts and is unexpected. So here's his quote. And while she herself is a war captive, pressed into service, she is not mean-spirited. She makes the best of her situation and even cares about the general's wife, and consequently, she cares about the general, unquote. Brueggemann, true evangelist, because she spoke what she remembered and believed about Elijah and saw the possibility of a different future for Naaman. Walter, and I've had dinner with future for the little girl. He doesn't address that. Okay, so now, little girl on the pedestal. These kind of assessments are part of, they're swallowing hook, line, and sinker the public transcript of the deterministic history. And the deterministic—
Denise, if I can jump in here real quick, there was one other idea about what was on her mind. And this was something you had told me about when we were discussing this earlier on, maybe was from some other commentator. And that is that when she says this about, that Naaman should go to the land of Israel, maybe she is hoping they will take her along. And once she's back in her home country of Samaria, it'll be a lot easier for her to slip away and get back to her own people.
Yes. And coupled with that, Jean, I'm glad you remembered that. Maybe she's seeking revenge by sending Naaman back into Israelite territory where people are still surely resentful of his raids and his victories. Yeah. No one breathes a word of that. Right? But that's reading the white fire, that's filling in the gaps. And that's taking seriously the disruption that her life has experienced, right? Thank you, Jean. Yeah. So what I read from people was the public transcript. They are following what I call Jeremiah 29:7. Actually, I don't call it the motto of exile. Lawrence Schiffman calls it that. Accept your punishment and pray for the welfare of the city where I have sent you. That is the motto of exile all the way up to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Greek Seleucid ruler in 175 BCE. In other words, suck it up and deal. Take responsibility for what got you here. Is the hidden transcript in the gap between verses 2 and 3, just listed one. If reading with interruption, as Dana Fuel suggests, to refuse to be passive readers, we need to decide if we're compliant. That is, we take the text on its face value, don't really spend much time on the little girl, she's just a foil. Most of us, I have to say, are compliant readers because it's easier. Be conversant readers, as Eric Seibert says in his book on violence in the Hebrew Bible. Conversant readers pay attention to the gaps. They pay attention to the white fire, okay? So I want to fill in the gaps by looking at the little girl as a trauma survivor. Her context is war and violence. And here I am informed by Judith Herman, groundbreaking physician who studied trauma. Her book, Trauma and Recovery, written in the late 1990s, is still quoted by everyone in trauma studies. And Judith Herman argues that victims become increasingly dependent on their perpetrators, on their abusers. And this is true no matter if we're talking about sexual abuse, spousal abuse, captive abuse, across the spectrum. Is this phenomenon of becoming dependent on the perpetrator. And this little girl's wish is that the final, well, before I say that, let me say some more about what Judith says. As the victim is isolated, she becomes increasingly dependent on the perpetrator bodily needs, but also for information and even for emotional sustenance. The more frightened she is, the more she is tempted to cling to the one relationship that is permitted to her, the relationship with the perpetrator. In the absence of any other human connection, she will try to find the humanity in her captor. It's for her survival. Inevitably, in the absence of any other point of view, the victim will come to see the world through the eyes of the perpetrator. The little girl's words in verse 3 as the final step in Naaman's psychological control of her. This little girl is wishing health for the man who ripped her from her family, killed her people, and keeps her captive in a foreign land. Maybe this wish expresses her adaptation to an abusive environment. As Judith Herman notes, the child trapped in an abusive environment is faced with formidable tasks of adaptation. She must find a way to preserve a sense of trust in people who are untrustworthy, safety in a situation that is unsafe, control in a situation that is terrifying, predictable, and power in a situation of helplessness, unquote. That is the little girl's situation in Aram. Naaman and his wife are not her biological parents. They're now her caretakers or owners. And that challenges the view of some commentators who argue that, quote, despite the trauma she has endured, this girl is faithful, respectful, and considerate. Really? I'd argue that instead, she is traumatized, desperate, and angling for protection. And in this situation, she has to find a way to preserve hope and meaning. She will try to be obedient, perhaps to overcome her self-blame and to earn the protection of her abusers. And in that sense, she becomes what Herman calls a double self. And we can only wonder, I say, what happened to her after Naaman was cured. But the Deuteronomic mystic history is trying to make a theological point at the little girl's expense. And in doing so, it glosses over her trauma, the context of war and violence. As I said before, we don't know her age. We don't know if her family was killed. We don't know if she was sexually abused by Naaman. We don't know. She's all alone from her country. And so by reading with interruption, we become what Daniel Smith Christopher calls secondary witnesses to her trauma. And we have responsibility to name that trauma. Why? Well, before I answer that question, I want to ask why we go along with the compliant readings that put her up on a pedestal. Maybe, I argue, we want to be like her. And we want to think that if we were in that situation, we would be faithful too. In her, what we want to see in ourselves. That's delusional. And so I leave you with this slide, and it's from Amy Cottrell. I recommend this book. It's called Uncovering Violence. There are different kinds of violence in the Bible, both Hebrew Bible and New Testament. If you don't think there's violence in the New Testament, read it again. Read Revelation, read Matthew and the fires that burn the sinners. There is direct violence, of course, but there's also interpretive violence. And I think the commentators who put the little girl on the pedestal were committing interpretive violence that basically glossed over the trauma of the little girl. There's also complicity with violence. And that is when we do not read the text with interruption and we gloss right over it. We take her captivity for granted as normal and we do not challenge it. And the whole point of this is this, the last line: to make the world less violent, we need to call out violence in the text so that we can see how we participate in violence in our own lives.
Hmm.
Huh.
Hmm.
Yeah. Huh. So, there's a contemporary example of this. It's not war, but it is a violence trauma for children. And it's the separation of families that occurred at our southern border from the migrants who were there. And the chair of the American Medical Association talked about the lifelong trauma that those children will experience, lifelong trauma. So, wherever you stand politically on that, I am just zeroing in on what is happening to actual children at the border, okay? So if we can see the trauma of this little girl, maybe we can see more clearly the trauma of other children across the world. I think of children in the Ukraine right now. I think of Palestinian children who have grown up in refugee camps. I lived on the West Bank for a year, and for a half year with our son. I've been there a total of a year and a half. I've seen those children in Palestinian camps. There are refugee camps in Scandinavian countries since World War II. Generations grow up in the camps. We don't even think twice about that anymore. We should. Any comments or questions?
I would just say, just to link this to our Lenten meditations, challenges, the fact even that Christ cited this story, a link there as far as our own faith and that of he who was crucified. What provoked you to choose this story for the Lenten challenge?
If we're contemplating the violence of the crucifixion, we have to see other kinds of violence in biblical texts. I think we have to come to terms with that violence. And as I said, by seeing it, naming it in the biblical text, we can perhaps more clearly label it in our own lives and see how we participate in it. That's why I chose it. I mean, if we're looking with Jesus toward violent crucifixion, then I thought this was a slam dunk in terms of a topic for the Lenten season. Again, this notion of characterological blame. We are so worthless that Jesus had to die so horribly for us. Really disempowering, right? And again, I think it's all rooted in a misinterpretation of Genesis 3. But that's another class. Does that answer your question, Carol?
No, that helps. I suspected that could be it, but yeah, I mean.
Yeah. And the way, interpreters interpret Jesus' use of text in the sermon in the Nazareth synagogue, they're all glossing over the little girl's violent experience too. because their main theological point is inclusiveness and God's sovereignty, universal sovereignty, right? Everybody's missing the boat here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other comments?
There's at least two more big sections of white space
Your cell phone.
there's at least two more big sections of white space in the passage that Jean read, each of which would be worth an hour or so. One is the pettiness of the response of the king of Israel and the short-sightedness of that. How do we
And-
interpret that?
Okay,
And
John?
then,
Well, let me speak to that first before we forget it. Number one, this is part of the Deuteronomistic history. And another aspect of the Deuteronomistic history is they are absolutely against the splitting of the kingdoms. So every single northern king was a bad king because those kings were not in the line of David. Okay?
okay,
So this is the Deuteronomistic history really making a buffoon out of the Israelite king because he wasn't in the Davidic line. And the people made a mistake by splitting the kingdom. Good read, Steve.
and then there's the self-aggrandizement of Elisha.
Ah.
Oh, yes, Steve. Oh, yes. Yes. But he's following in his mentor's footsteps. Remember Elijah when Queen Jezebel tried to kill him? You know, he killed 400 of her Baal. That was okay. But when she tries to kill the prophets of Israel, including Elijah, it's not okay. And one of the things I have in my class is killing in the name of one God okay and not in the name of another God, but that's for another time. And so when Elijah runs away and God talks to him when he's under the broom tree, you know, God says, what do you hear? And you should hear Elijah go, oh, only I have been zealous for the Lord, right? So there's this sense of, you know, look at, I've been doing my job, look at, I'm exemplary and this is what I get. So Elisha cycles of that kind of label it arrogance, I would, but in service of the Deuteronomistic historian who's trying to make a point about God's universal sovereignty, right? Good read, Steve. There's so much in these texts. These are incredible storytellers. These Hebrew narratives are masterful. Anything else?
Denise, you should know that we already have requests for your third session, knowing that we can't do it next week.
Yeah, and we can't do it in May because I'm absolutely swamped.
So we'll look for a time to come back to it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Paul, perhaps.
'Cause,
Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
it is so much fun intellectually to do these deep dives and to challenge ourselves. What's in that white space? And-
Yeah, that's what.
And
That's
how does that change? And how does that change how we read it?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, reading with interruptions. Stop.
Yep.
Yeah, stop, look, and listen. Didn't they teach that to elementary kids? Stop, look, right? Yeah.
So next week, we will be introduced to a new friend. Donna Graves will be our speaker next week. She is our new seminary intern from Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Richmond. And she will be talking about how they teach racism and social justice in seminary now. So that should be a very interesting topic and a really good one for Palm Sunday.
Yes.
And we hope to see everybody then.
Although I would add that at Wesley, we've been teaching about race for a long time. And every course, especially in Bible.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I somehow don't think that it's a new topic at Richmond.
No.
No, no, it would not be. We
But-
got some good
but-
people there. Yeah.
But how it has morphed and is morphing will be a very interesting read.
Yeah, sounds
She's-
great.
And she's bringing with her the director of that clinical study program.
Oh, good. Oh, that
Yeah.
sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, you're all wonderful. Thank you
No,
very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
And-
so much.
Blessings as we head up to Easter, and may God's face shine on you all.
And to you as well.
Thank you so much.
you.
Denise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
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 Send some sunshine our way, Alvin.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks.